Welcome to Bishop Barron Presents. I'm Jared Zimmer, the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and in this episode, Bishop Barron sits down with Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson, who's a literary and theological scholar, and in this conversation, they talk about the humanities, Flannery O'Connor, Dostoevsky, Walker Percy, numerous other aspects of human formation. So be sure to sit back, relax, and enjoy. So I thought maybe what we could talk about to begin with is the value of the humanities and what might occur if the humanities start to decline in our education system. So maybe, Doctor, if you could start off the conversation.
Can you call me Jessica?
Jessica, that sounds good.
Yeah. Instead of Doctor.
Call me Bishop.
Okay.
The decline of humanities has already started,
Yeah.
really. And what is going to be lost is in the name of humanities. We're going to lose what it means to be human. And you would say, well, that's not something you really have to study how to be a human being. But it is. You have to train a child in the way the child should go. And so every practice from the time that the child is young, you're thinking about what's the best food for this kid, what's the best music for them to listen to, what's the best media for them to enjoy. And then suddenly in college, they're okay. And let's just make them specialists and make them workers. Well, where did their humanity go? Where did all of those other decisions that made them who they are? Why did we leave those out? Don't we still care about what they're reading, what they're looking at, the art that's around them, the ways they think about how to vote, the ways that they think about how to participate in relationships, the ethical decisions they're going to make, and then the very purpose of who they are? Why don't those things matter anymore? And they should. And so that's what the humanities are meant to offer a person, is really the training, the formation for who they're supposed to be in the world.
Yeah. Do you think that there's such a focus on, and we're not anti-science by any means, but there is such a focus on this STEM aspect of knowledge, that is there a part of the humanities that offers maybe a different kind of knowledge that the STEM simply can't offer?
Well, of course, and that's the relevant point. As you say, quite rightly, and we love the sciences. And I fight the battle a lot of people saying, oh, the church is anti-science. I say, no, the church loves the sciences. But I almost every day confront this on my social media, is young people especially who fall in the trap of saying the only legitimate form of knowledge is the scientific form of knowledge. So if you can see it and you can measure it and you can do experiments on it, then that's true. Everything else is a matter of private opinion, or it's your little pet ideas or something. They have lost a sense, I think, what you were saying, that the humanities are themselves a bearer of truth. So when you read Shakespeare, or you read Plato, you read Dante, that's not just someone's little private ideas. They're conveying deep truths about, as you say, what it means to be human. What's a right ethical choice? What makes something beautiful? What makes something just? What's the purpose of your life? Well, the scientific method, with all of its strengths, can't answer those questions. So when you lose the humanities, you lose that. Or another way, I think about it a lot, that the sciences and their attendant technology make life a lot more convenient. Thank God for that. What we're doing right now would be impossible without the sciences. They have this wonderful technology around us. They get us places faster, God knows. But then what do we do when we get there? Now that your life is so convenient, well, how do you live? Now the great questions of ethics and humanity and purpose and meaning kick in. And I think that's one reason why a lot of younger people are kind of lost. Because they have all the STEM knowledge, terrific, but then what do I do once I get there? That's why we need the humanities.
Yeah, many of the great scientists were formed in the humanities. So if we have a science subtracted or without the humanities, you might end up with a very unethical science, right?
Yeah, can I add to that? So
Please.
Thinking more in terms of liberal arts rather than just the humanities, I think is important. So science and mathematics, really what we would call the nonverbal arts, should be ways of also understanding that purpose, why we're here. You're really discovering the language of God and how you measure yourself within the world, right? And so it's just a different language that God can speak through. And the sciences can do that as well. But what we've done to the sciences is made them only useful. And it's their utilitarian value that we try to focus on. And by doing so, I think we've actually deflated science itself as well. We've lost the enchanted power of science. And when you've subtracted it from the story of the liberal arts, then you don't have the history of the great scientists. You don't have the analogies and metaphors that poetry offers us, in which scientists learn how to re-examine, to invent, They become creative in the ways that they process their world and come up with new ideas. And by subtracting it from that story, even the sciences themselves become unmoored.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. Think of someone like Aristotle, you know. He did make distinctions between, let's say, physics, mathematics, metaphysics, but he would have seen all of it under the rubric of seeing. So the mind that seeks to know, that seeks to see, and there are different ways of doing that. But he wouldn't have driven a wedge between physics and his poetics, between physics and his rhetoric, between ethics and metaphysics. They're all part of a system. And right, that's kind of disintegrated. Where those who are concerned with ethics, well, that's got nothing to do with physics. Aristotle didn't think so, Or mathematics has no relation to metaphysics. The classic people didn't think so.
Right.
The medievals didn't think so. So yeah, that loss of integration, you're right, I think is super problematic.
And one of the ways in which the humanities in general or liberal learning is being attacked is also a questioning of the canon itself. And there's a big question right now of what do we do with the canon? Do we expand it? Do we hold fast to it? Maybe some thoughts on that.
I think a canon is only as good as the people who are embodying it and living it out. This is Louise Cowan, who's one of my teachers at University of Dallas. University of Dallas really proposes the great books are necessary. That content is necessary to form us, that there's something that happens in these texts. But Cowan said the great books are only great because you're living them. If you stop embodying the wisdom in those texts, then they're meaningless, right? And so the great books, the canon has to be a living thing. Yeah. Which means that there's not just a content that you can kind of hand on like a product, one from the next, right? That's really a market way of looking at the canon. Instead, if you look at it as like an organism that grows and plants new seeds and produces a garden that flourishes and there's life there. And so an expansion of the canon is just kind of a natural growth of things as certain things need to die and certain things need to grow.
Yeah, I think that's right. I have zero quarrel with expanding the canon and inviting, different people and voices into it. Now, it takes time. That's the whole point of the canon, is things that have stood the test of time, and you say, yes, this speaks somehow to our common humanity. And I think that's the main point, is what's bugging me today is so much stress on our particularity or our kind of tribal identity that we overlook the fact that Dante could speak to a kid from South Central LA if it's properly explained to him and properly open to him. I don't see why Shakespeare couldn't speak to a kid from Oxnard, California, if it's properly open to him, because they speak to our common humanity, to these great themes of what it means to be alive and to be morally upright, et cetera, et cetera. So I love that about the canonical literature, is it appeals to everybody. Now, expand it, absolutely, absolutely. We shouldn't be monolithic about the canon, but you also got to be patient. You can't say, well, let's just add 25 things to the canon. Well, you need time to see if these things have enduring value,
Well, Martin Luther King, who studied the classics, right, and studied the great books, and he said to judge a person by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And then somehow we're reversing that, and we're choosing authors to include only based on the color of the skin and not the timeless content of person's character. At the same time, that if you have a canon without Martin Luther King now, then you have a problem, because he took the tradition and he spoke into it, and now he's someone that we should be responding to. But if we would have only chose what we thought was relevant, we actually would have condescended to Martin Luther King Jr. and not given him the resources he needed to be able to play the part that he had at that kingdom moment. So you consider writers like Countee Cullen, African-American poet. Who was his inspiration? John Keats. Yeah. Are you going to pick a YA novel with someone who had the same skin color and assume that Countee Cullen could only understand that story because they share that one aspect of their identity? Countee Cullen knew it was a human story that he recognized in that poet, and that's what he wanted to perpetuate.
That's good to think of someone like King, who was inspired deeply by Gandhi, but also by Paul Tillich. So here's people from very different cultures, but he draws upon them. And of course, the scriptures, which are from an entirely different cultural framework. I love what you said about the living quality of the canon, because that, to me, is reminiscent of John Henry Newman, someone that we have in common. Newman saw the tradition as a living thing. It's organic. You don't just hand it on like a football. And so there I quite agree. with those who critique, a sort of monolithic or, unchanging view of the canon. No, the canon's alive, and it's received, it's talked about, it's criticized, it's passed on to you, then you do your own criticisms and assessments and pass it back to someone else. That's the way we should see it, I think. It's alive.
I always think about one of Mortimer Adler's goals. Actually, he mentions it in the introduction of the Syntopicon, that he wanted to do a Great Books of the East, but he just didn't have the time or the resources necessary to do it. And so why not? Let's start looking at canons from different areas of the world and the influences that they have and how they speak to each other. I mean, to me, that's the human thing, right? How they speak to each other.
And it's a good point, Jared, because there's only so much a person can do. I mean, we only live for 70 or 80 years, and we're trained in a certain way. So I was trained in, mostly the Western philosophical and theological classics. Okay, that's what I've got, and I can talk about that. Well, why aren't you talking about this, that, and the other? Well, I wasn't really trained to do it. Now off you go. You do it. I train people to open up other texts, So kind of expect everyone to do everything at the same time is a little unrealistic.
And I agree with you. I think at the same time, we also need to recognize that sometimes these cultures are present even in the text we were studying. So when I was taught Herodotus, we didn't focus on the other people's groups that are actually being talked about in that text. So part of it also could just be a matter of perspective and retraining our ways of reading even the Western canon, because I'm like you, I've read mostly the Western canon, right? And so part of it is opening up the conversation to see what we've missed. The other part is to return to those texts and see what we've missed even in them, right? That could be brought forth and brought to life. Because if it has always been a human story, then those resources are probably there, and we weren't looking for them.
Yeah, and something that I think this kind of lends itself towards as well is getting back a little bit to our earlier conversation about the formation of the human person and formation of ultimately the human soul, right? And if we're talking about these different areas of knowledge, and of course if you think about the canon, it's philosophy and science and math and numerous other aspects of human existence. But what we've lost, unfortunately, in light of this kind of scientific age, is this literary form of knowledge. Things that literature specifically can speak to the human person. And so I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what is it about literature in particular that can really help inspire and inform the human mind.
You're definitely speaking my language.
Yeah.
This is what I love. So for me, we are living in a culture that seems to be very self-focused. Everyone is individualistic. We're our own autonomous entities. And literature demands that you shut up and listen to someone else. And you actually listen to them. Because literature, you open those pages and someone else is speaking to you. Yeah. They're sharing their story and they're telling who they are. So you are actually practicing humility. And Flannery O'Connor would say a lot of these things happen without the reader being aware. We don't always have to pull back the curtain and get behind the scenes and give them a look at what's happening to them. But it is happening. There's a mystery that occurs between you and the text in which you're being trained in humility, you're being trained in empathy, you're being attuned to beauty, you're being asked to slow down and not immediately respond because you have to read the next sentence, right? And so there's things that literature asks of you that our current mediums don't ask, that our current ways of being in the world don't ask from us. And so we're being trained differently, counterculturally, to the water we swim in.
Yeah.
Something that you and I have in common is the use of literature in theology. So I love high abstract ideas and expressing things that way, but I've also used, as you do, Flannery O'Connor and Dante and William Faulkner and many others to explicate these truths. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is just how beautifully multivalent a literary symbol can be, or a character. So an idea tends to have, a pretty straightforward univocal meaning. Here's what this idea is about. Good, it's got the virtue of clarity. But a character in a story, a symbol, an archetype, a mythic presentation has all this wonderful multivalence. The other thing I think is the narrative quality. When you're showing a life in progress, you're showing something unfolding across space and time, it opens it up in a way that an idea just can't. So what's the good life? Well, I can talk about it the way Aristotle does, abstractly in terms of virtues and so on. Or I can show virtues. I can look at this person. What's vice? What goes wrong with us? Well, look at the way this life is unfolded. Look how that decision was made. Well, it's only a narrative art that can really display that. You know, that's why I've used it a lot. And the Bible is narrative. It's not so much philosophical. You can distill philosophy from it, as the great figures have, but it's basically narrative in form or poetic in form. So I think that's a natural place for theologians to go, in the Christian tradition anyway.
Right. I mean, I've used this example a lot. Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
You have Ivan Karamazov who's arguing. He's giving all the reasons. He says he has a Euclidean mind. This goes back to the poor use of mathematics or scientific training, right?
Yeah.
So he has a Euclidean mind to try to understand suffering in the world and understand God. And how does Dostoevsky answer him? He doesn't say, you're wrong, suffering isn't bad. Instead, he says, your argument is right, your response is not. And he shows the life of Zosima in response to that suffering. Because really, it's which story do you want to live out, right? Not who wins the argument, but whoever wins the argument, how do you live? Yeah. And that's what stories do, exactly what the bishop was saying. How do you live then? And that's what stories can give us.
What a genius, of course, Dostoevsky at so many levels. And he knew the rationalism of his own time, you know. So the wake of the Enlightenment, then through French influence coming into Russia and so on. He knew those strains, but then was just, he saw the way a lot of postmoderns do now, the dark side of the Enlightenment, you know, the limitations of that kind of rationalism. And you're right, especially when applied to something like religion, that Ivan, you know, coming out of that sort of Enlightenment rationalism is going to miss whole worlds of experience and meaning. And he was such a genius at showing the...
Yeah. Well, even the lack of humility in that one particular example, what we were just talking about, the literature can form you in humility. Here you have someone who, instead of learning from literature, Ivan studies science and then tries to write his own poem and then tells Alyosha the entire time, this is how you're supposed to respond to this poem that I'm writing, right? There's a lack of humility in his approach to the world for the things that he cannot understand. And if instead he was studying these lives and reading these lives, Dostoevsky seems to suggest that the study of literature would somehow reform him or change him or offer him an opportunity to see differently.
Yeah. Yeah, and I tend to think of, Edmund Burke he suffered no fools whenever it came to treating people as abstractions, right? And something that literature does is it takes us from the abstract into the concrete. You're actually living vicariously through the life of this character, and you, as you said, there's empathy and sympathy that comes about because of it. But I want to touch on that reality in Dostoevsky, O'Connor, many of these other authors, of course, that you're a scholar in regard to suffering. I think especially, Chris, in your book, Giving the Devil His Due, you really get into the idea of suffering in their works as well as the Girardian treatment of that. And so maybe to start off with, let's start with Dostoevsky, how does he frame suffering? And that's consistently one of the reasons why atheists would say that they don't believe is because of suffering. And so how does Dostoevsky handle that issue?
Well, one is that he allows for mystery. He allows for the possibility that he's not going to be able to answer that question sufficiently. And he says suffering is here. And it's not going to be changed by us believing or not believing in God, but how we help the actual embodied sufferer is what changes. And that's what he does in his fiction, is he shows someone like Alyosha going to the bedside of a young boy who's dying and praying over him, being with him, helping the family through this suffering, and then even afterwards helping the friends at the grave of this youth. He's being present to them in their suffering. And of course, that's Christ's example, right? To be with us in our suffering, to come down and show us that he participated in suffering, the ultimate loss, and we can see our sufferings then in him, right? That he's one of us. I was thinking about this in terms of people who, I guess, think Christ is abstract, that Jesus Christ would even be an abstract figure or character. And yet, what does he ask his disciples? Can you drink the cup that I'm drinking? So he's not talking abstractly about suffering. He's taking it on, and then he's passing the cup to them. And that's the invitation to follow him is an invitation into that suffering. And it's a mystery. It's a really difficult mystery.
There's so much there, and I think that's right. It's the hinge issue. I've been in a lot of debates over the years with atheists and agnostics, and of course, we always come back to this problem, the problem of suffering and evil. I always say, you want the very best, you want me to steel man your argument. The best place I know is in the Brothers Karamazov, at the heart of a deeply Christian novel. the way Ivan presents the awful suffering of children. And he brings out these cases. And isn't it true, I think I read this somewhere, that Dostoevsky actually got some of those from real newspaper accounts. So these weren't just fantasies of his, but real accounts of innocent children suffering in the most terrible way. I don't know any atheist who's ever expressed it as sort of bluntly and clearly as that. But then you're right, that's the hinge issue. What do you do now with that? So the Ivan approach is to say, therefore there can be no God. God, there can't be an all-good, all-knowing God if such things exist. But that's to look at it in an entirely rationalistic way. And I think the key is, we all know from the story, Ivan would never lift a finger to help a suffering person. So his sympathy isn't really sympathy, It's, as Flannery O'Connor said, right, divorced from the source of compassion. And so it really becomes an abstract response. The Christian response, and you're absolutely right, is acknowledging the mystery of it. That yes, the all-good God has somehow in his providence, that's true, permitted this sort of thing. Now why, I don't know. And that's from Augustine through Thomas Aquinas, all of our great figures will say something like that, I don't know. But, so what do? You serve those who suffer. You go into the space of the innocent child who's suffering, and you give your life the way Christ did. And that's the answer proposed, seems to me, by the brothers Karamazov, which is the best answer. It does honor the intellectual side. Yeah, there's an all-good God, and there's this awful suffering. And I don't know how it fits into God's providence, though I know the all-good God has allowed it. Okay, that's an intellectual response. But then the more powerful one is the ethical and spiritual response of identification with those who suffer. Isn't it, the scene you're describing there is at the tail end of the book, isn't it? When Alyosha has been caring for, and that's how it ends with the kids saying, hurrah for Karamazov, right? That it ends, this very dark novel, but it ends on this upbeat note, right? The kids are cheering for this Alyosha because following his master, Zosima, he follows the path of Christ, That's the answer. I don't know a better posing of the problem or a better posing of a solution than Dostoevsky.
Right.
Anyway, your books, by the way, helped me see a lot of this more clearly, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I immediately think of Father Zosima's sort of indication between the two different kinds of love, right? Love and dreams and love and action.
Yeah.
So maybe we could kind of delve into that, of the difference between the two.
Sure. I mean, now we could say love through GoFundMe and social media, and love with those that you are actually next to that are hard to love. I'll give this example of, just to be like completely vulnerable, and how I've learned love. I live in a very small town, and that means that I don't get to choose who I interact with and kind of separate myself from the people who disagree with me or the people who don't like me, because our kids still go to kindergarten together, and that's no one in particular. But our kids still go to kindergarten together, and we still see each other regularly, and we have to have love for one another. Because as many ways that we might rub each other wrong, we are the church. And that's what Christ has called us to. And that's what Dostoevsky is saying. He's saying, can you not just love the mission field that's far away from you and send money over to people who you've never met, but can you love the person next door who keeps, cutting down your bushes, or the person next door who puts the giant political sign in their yard saying they want to vote for someone you don't like? Yeah. Can you still love that person? That's the harder ask, and that's what Dostoevsky is trying to point out.
What's the line? Is it, Jared, the famous line about love is a harsh and dreadful thing, right? But it doesn't he say love in action is a harsh and dreadful? So it's that distinction, right? The sort of abstract, divorced from the source of compassion, that kind of love, or love through the internet and so on. But real love in action, love in fact, is a harsh and dreadful thing for all the reasons that we're talking about. Because it's coming to grips with this problem, the problem of suffering, and it means it's going to cost you. It's a costly discipleship. All of that. That's the best response to it.
And especially, I think, in the social media age, we tend to have these global concerns. You know, it wasn't that long ago where people didn't know what was happening on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
But now all of us know a lot of things about what's going on in places where we will never actually meet the people involved. And so it's not to necessarily negate the need to care for the global reality, but it is to say the focus, especially of what you can actually act in, is the local concern.
Right.
Right?
Well, and to quote Flannery, Flannery's always running through my head. Talk about living a text.
Yeah.
And she says, people want to say that love is an electric blanket when actually it's the cross.
Yeah.
And that's a big difference, right? Love means that something costs, like you just said, that's what it made me think of. And love means it hurts, and love means it's particular and it's localized. And it's not a warm, fuzzy feeling. And most of the people that you love are not going to love you back the way you feel like you deserve.
Yeah.
And that's the difficulty about love.
Yeah, the sentimentalization of love, for sure. And our language trips us up in English. We don't have the right words to make those distinctions, but we tend to sentimentalize it automatically. And that's why, like Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor are so good at showing that, you know, the cross quality of real love and what it costs you, and the entry into the suffering of the innocent. I mean, the way that's, and even entry into the suffering prompted by the guilty. I mean, to enter into that space. That's the answer to the problem of suffering. You can do it. Like just a few weeks ago in this very studio, I had a dialogue with this young fellow from England who's a fierce atheist, you know. So we talked about arguments for God and so on, but eventually we got back to the problem of suffering. One of his, by the way, is animal suffering, the suffering of innocent animals, you know. How could this be reconciled with God? And, you know, I expressed abstractly the answer from Augustine on about, you know, God permits so as to bring about a greater good. But what that is, I don't know. I can't see. No one can see. I can't see clearly, oh, that's the greater good. I can state it, but then the more important move now is to enter in and say, okay, perhaps at least part of that greater good is that I've been called to love. I've been called to self-gift, you know. I don't know a better answer. That's what I mean about the Brothers Karamazov. A better statement of the problem and a better answer than you find there.
And one of the notes that you have in your book as well is that part of our natural outrage in regard to innocent suffering is the fact that we naturally recognize the imago Dei in the individual. And do you think that an argument based on that could also kind of start going from the literary into the philosophic?
No, please go ahead.
Sure. I think it's about how you imagine that image. And what I mean by that is I've, over the last few years, feel like people have become so busy creating a persona that they even see themselves incorrectly. So then when they view others, they're not seeing other people even clearly in what the image of God looks like. So O'Connor, for example, would say, I judge myself by the truth, and therefore I see all that I lack. And that's the starting place of self-knowledge. It's actually a very humble place. Whereas right now in our culture, we're constantly trying to get people to hold up mirrors, and the image that you present is amazing. Have self-esteem, believe in yourself, see yourself as great and worthy. And so it's not really the image of God that people are seeing. They're seeing the unfallen, you don't need redemption version of the self that you're putting out there. Whereas O'Connor would want to say, you actually need to see yourself maybe from an icon perspective, right? Where God is speaking to you from that perspective, where you're trying to understand how God sees you and what you lack, but then he redeems you. So in Dostoevsky, he talks about everybody's responsible for everyone's sin. There's this ultimate guilt that's the starting point, right? But the guilt is not the end of the story. The end of the story then is that he's leading you to become a child of God, which so you're more loved than you are even guilty, right? And that's the miracle of grace. And so when we're trying to see the imago Dei in others, we're really good at seeing their guilt and not ours, but we're really not great at seeing their grace and the child of God there. The way we need to. So I think if we began by seeing first our need for redemption, we'd be better at seeing other people as those in need of redemption, and that we can participate in that redemptive process.
There's Flannery O'Connor with the misfit and the grandmother,
Yes.
right, along those lines. But I was thinking too, Jared, and your book helped me see this too, is go back to Ivan Karamazov and how outrageous that these innocent children, how terrible that they're suffering. Well, I mean, would he be bothered by the death of, a million mosquitoes? It was, well, no, clearly not. It wouldn't bother. So why is that bothering him? Why is that bothering him? If and only if, it seems to me, he has some sense of these children as bearers of the Imago Dei. He's got some sense they're of infinite value and worth. And so, in a way, it turns on itself. The only problem more puzzling than the problem of evil is the problem of good. And if evil really is a privatio boni, right? It's a privation of the good, and where sin abounds, grace abounds the more. I mean, all those insights are meant to show that even behind this awful protest of Ivan Karamazov is at least the implicit acknowledgement that no, these children are the beloved children of God, and that's why we should care about them, So in a way, like, grace always runs around sin.
That's good.
And I think that's true in Flannery O'Connor and so many. They look right at sin, as Dostoevsky does. No one sees it more clearly, but they know that where sin abounds, grace abounds the more. And God's love is greater than, That's the move. It's not an either or. It's where sin abounds, grace abounds the more.
I think of that O'Connor essay in which I think she quotes Wyndham Lewis, and he says, if I'm writing about the rotting hill, it's not because I like the rot. It's because I cared about the hill.
Right.
And I think that's what we're trying to see, and that's a really great point that you bring up. That's what Yvonne and O'Connor are showing, is that they love the children. The rot shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
That evil shouldn't be there.
Say more about, because I'm so intrigued by it. When Flannery O'Connor, in that famous preface to the, what's it called, the Memoir of Marianne, right?
Yes.
And she refers directly to Ivan Karamazov, But then say more about it, because that quote about when you cut your own compassion off from the source of compassion, the next step is the death camps.
Right.
Right. Say more about that, because I think that's a fascinating connection she makes.
I think it begins with humility, but it's also about incarnation. Everything from O'Connor goes to incarnation, but our incarnation is the ultimate example of humility, right? God, who did not consider himself equal with God, came down and took the form of a human being. So it's that Philippians passage. And so what she sees happening there is that you have the humility to step down into the suffering, not to stand above it and try to solve the problem. You enter into it, and you're willing to die for it. You're willing to receive that suffering. And that's what most people are not willing to do. When they're trying to solve problems from this place of tenderness or compassion, they're doing so from this pride in which they stand over the suffering problem, and they're not willing to take it on themselves. They just want to solve it, which means eradicating it, sending money, and whatever they need to do to stand above it and solve it. And that's not how our God responds to suffering. He responds by becoming a sufferer, right? Becoming the suffering servant. And so that's why she says that's the source of real compassion. Tenderness
is the word. You're right, that she uses there. And then it leads to the death camps, because from that sort of rationalistic standpoint, we'll solve this problem. And, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet, and so if we got to kill a million people, well, we're going to solve the problem. That's, if you want tenderness, because look at someone like Marx or the great sort of utopian figures. Yeah, they were trying to solve some great injustice or what they perceived to be a terrible suffering, but then it was cut off from the source of tenderness, and the result is the death camps. Man, I think that's of extraordinary relevance to the conversation today. Because when you start saying, well, there's no God, and who cares about that, and I'm an atheist, and so on, but boy, do I care about social justice. I'm going to get out of the way, because that's dangerous stuff. That line of Flannery's, I think we should do whatever we can to propagate that, because as usual, it's a remark of hers that sheds light in every direction, right? And today, I think it's of enormous importance. You start playing the social justice game without God, the death camps aren't that far behind. It's the point she's making there.
Right. You actually have to be a human being in the image of God and see yourself that way in order to be a humanitarian. Right? And this is where the humanities come in again, is that how are you being formed? Because if you're a benevolent dictator, right, so you're just still an oppressor. And I think to even bring this more close to home than O'Connor would have, because she was seeing it at a large scale, and she was seeing the Holocaust in Europe. That's what she was responding to. But right now, we're seeing the same kind of tenderness cut off from the source of tenderness when we see our loved ones in the hospital. And they're choosing to die rather than to inconvenience those they love. Or those around them are choosing to let them go, or to have physician-assisted suicide, or something along those lines, because they don't want to see them suffer. But it's compassion that's missing the mystery of the cross that would have to actually endure that suffering because God's doing something bigger that we can't understand. But without that level of humility before that mystery, then we have the audacity to step in and try to solve the problem ourselves. And that is leading to greater violence and more death.
Yeah. And the saints show that to us. That's why, like Dostoevsky putting Father Zosima at the center of the story there. I mean, look. That's what it looks like when you enter into the suffering of others. And we can't solve the problem abstractly, but we show the saints. And that's the church's job, to hold up the saints. Look what they did. Mother Teresa, So let's say Mother Teresa and Karl Marx both saw enormous social problems and the suffering of people. But Mother Teresa was tenderness connected to the source of tenderness. And that turns into her life, But the other one is a very dangerous road. It's a very dangerous road.
Yeah, something you mentioned in your book as well is if you don't have the mimetics of God, using the Girardian term, you will find the gas chambers, basically, if you don't have something to copy. So maybe if you could explain a little bit about what Girard meant by the mimetic desire and how that plays into suffering and also goodwill. How does those work out?
Sure. I think a lot of us have this idea that we're truly original, and and yet the very fact that we look like our parents or that we are coming from other people should show us proof that we're not our own original being, that we are taking after others. And so all in creation is inscribed this desire to model others. So people have the search for the father figure. They want to be like a certain kind of father. They want to be like a certain kind of person. When you imagine the models for the kind of life you want to live, you may look at your parents or your grandparents, or you may look at superstars and Avengers and whoever else. You're going to find some sort of example. How do I want to live? I'm going to look at a person and decide how I want to live. And so that's what Girard is talking about. What the problem comes in is when you think that you're original, you don't realize that you're actually modeling and imitating people. And so this has happened without your acknowledgement of it. And therefore, when someone else seems to be trying to be the same kind of person you are, then there's a combat, right? Because two gods can't occupy the same circle. And so you instead combat against each other, and it leads to violence. And that's what Girard is pointing out. On the positive side, it really does show that the church needs to be lifting up their saints first and foremost, the embodied gospel being carried forward by the Holy Spirit, and that those are the examples you should lay yourself down before and imitate. If you're going to imitate something, right, you're either going to do it unaware, and therefore you're going to be a slave to an image you didn't even mean to create in yourself. Or you lay down that choice and say, I want to be like Mother Teresa. I want to be like Saint Teresa. I want to be like Saint Catherine. And you make that conscious decision to imitate them.
And there's an admirable either or that comes out. You bring that out in your books, and you see it in Flannery, certainly. You see it in Dostoevsky. We might flatter ourselves and think, oh, we're very subtle, and we move into this, nuanced area. But in point of fact, as my musical hero Bob Dylan put it, it may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody, right? So Dylan laid it out with a kind of Kierkegaardian, clarity. It is an either or. That decision is an either or because I think, as you suggest, the autonomous self is in fact a plaything of the devil. So you think, I'm autonomous. I'm making my own decisions here.
Right.
But when you do that, ipso facto, you're imitating the one who was the liar and murderer from the beginning, who claimed autonomy. Who was like, I'm like God. So in fact, the autonomous self is under thrall to a dark spiritual power, and Flannery's stories certainly, I think, are pointing it out.
Yes.
The moment when you've got to decide, okay, it might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody, and I think the church's job in many ways, maybe we've been derelict in this, but is to propose that to people. And don't flatter yourself that you're finding some autonomous, neutral space. In fact, that's the only decision that finally matters. Whom do you imitate, And so the imitatio Christi, the great tradition within our spiritual teaching, and then that's laid out in the saints, those who did effectively imitate Christ. But I think that's a very important point that you bring out. It is an either or, whether we like it or not, and we might delude ourselves. But like Flannery's stories and Dostoevsky too are meant to bring that into clear focus,
Well, and O'Connor wrote this great essay. She gave a talk in response to a Life magazine article, and it said, "Who speaks for America today?" And we're the most prosperous country in the world. This is in the 1950s, right? And therefore, we need to talk about the joy, meaning the material blessings that we're enjoying. And O'Connor said, you know who actually speaks for America today? The advertising agencies. They're telling you what to imitate. They're telling you who to be. And so you think that you're being this autonomous individual, but in reality, you're only wanting the things the world is telling you to want. You're desiring the things the world is telling you to desire. And so you have become enslaved. So you either choose to worship the advertising agencies and follow their example, or you worship Jesus, which does not mean just prospering and speaking only of material blessings, but it means the cross, again.
And part of getting back to the idea of liberal learning as well, it helps you allow for those distinctions, right? You can recognize this person's trying to influence me in some way because you've already been liberally educated to understand the realities of human nature and what we do. But one question I did have in regard to particularly O'Connor and Dostoevsky, you know, their stories can be so dark at times, but are the stories ultimately nihilistic, or do they find themselves fulfilled in kind of a hopeful end? And is that kind of maybe the beauty within the darkness? How does that work?
Oh, I think so. I think they're stories of grace. And we referenced the ending to the Brothers Karamazov. I think that's, again, a very dark story, and the guy looking really, really clearly at human dysfunction. But it does end, I think, on that graceful note. Flannery O'Connor, for sure. I mean, didn't she say at one point, my stories are about the offer of grace usually refused? So, okay, we often refuse it, but the stubborn divine offer of grace, I mean, that breaks through our defenses. You know, and maybe the greatest defense that God has to break through is our conviction that we don't need to be saved, that we're okay. You know, Mrs. Turpin, I mean, I'm fine. I'm thank you, Jesus, for making me so wonderful. That's what the Lord has to break through. But they're always about grace. Because Flannery O'Connor would have known that whole Pauline trajectory of sin abounding, but grace abounds the more. God's grace is always greater than our sin. But that allows her to look so clearly. That's why, see, when people say, oh, how could... I used to have my students read Flannery O'Connor, and they'd say, why are you making us read these awful stories? I say, because she's a Christian. That's why, because she can look so clearly because she knows that's not the whole story. If you're convinced that this world's all we got, well, then you better, you know, gussy this thing up a little bit. But if you're convinced of the reality of the transcendent and of grace, you can look with very clear eyes at the world, as Dostoevsky does, because you know there's more to it. You know there's the offer of grace that transcends it, you know?
Yes, I think that you're exactly right. Dostoevsky and O'Connor, they're writing, focusing a lot on Good Friday, but they're always pointing to the resurrection. Yeah. Their stories are always comedy. They're going to descend into hell and take you there. And they're going to hopefully move their characters and their reader through purgatory, which is going to burn and be uncomfortable. Yeah. But their ultimate goal is that you put your eyes on paradise, that there's something beyond those things that hurt and those things that are dark. But they are going to move you through that trajectory, through that journey. And Flannery O'Connor's most anthologized story is A Good Man is Hard to Find. And The Misfit gives that either or we've been talking about. You either believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins and he rose again. And if you believe that, there is nothing for you to do but to follow him. If you don't, and he did not do that, then there's nothing for you to do but kill people and burn down their houses, right? There's nothing but pleasure and meanness. And at the end of that story, he actually kills the grandmother who lived her entire life not recognizing that choice between those two things. She wanted to live a happy life where this world was all there was, and Jesus was a compartmentalized part of that existence of happiness, and then she dies at the end. And everyone who reads that story is like, she dies at the end. It's a horrible, sad story. There's a dead body at the end of the story. Well, no. Who actually matters in this story? The reader, the person who's an actual being. The fiction is meant to hold that gun vicariously to the reader's head and give you a chance to answer that question and then walk away and live differently from that story. The grandmother didn't actually exist. She's fictional. She's a parable. Yeah. How are you going to live after you hear the parable? Are you still going to be hard of ear and blind, or did you see something in that story and you want to live differently?
And she dies with a smile on her face, looking up to heaven. And she's in the ditch. So, I mean, she's gone down to a very dark low place, but then she's looking up to heaven, because in that reaching out to the misfit, you're one of my own children. Grace has broken through. Something has happened to her. And in a way, like Flannery probably say, oh, she was ready at that point.
Yeah,
she got it. And so she's shot to death, but she's smiling and looking up in heaven. And then isn't it the misfit at the end cleans his glasses off? Like the misfit has also come to see something. Mm-hmm. And it's his friend comes back from having killed the whole family and said, oh, some fun. And he goes, no, there's no pleasure in life. And you think, what a downer. But no, but he's refusing that option he had laid out. Mm-hmm. If Jesus is not who he says he is, the only thing left is taking pleasure in meanness. And the misfit at the end says, no, there's no pleasure in that. So what did he see? I mean, I always sense the grandmother is looking up to heaven. She was ready. She saw something. And the misfit, having cleaned his glasses, sees something too. Now, she's never going to say, oh, they're both great. Yeah, they both got it all figured out. Mm-hmm. But there's a glimmer, seems to me, of grace in both of them, But she can look so long and hard at the darkness because she gets the light, And grace is just stubborn. Mm-hmm. God's grace is stubborn. It will not let us go. And the misfit, what an awful figure. It's murderer. But yet grace is operative. Grace is trying to break through. And he cleans the glasses. He can see something.
Well, and even the cleaning of the glasses, right? Why is he cleaning the glasses? Well, either he's crying because he had a revelation, right? Or someone who just reached out and said, you're one of my children. Mm-hmm. Someone who claimed him and offered belonging to him, that person's blood is on his glasses. So now there's a literal cleaning by the blood in that moment for that man from someone who has offered to see him as her child. There's something beautiful that happens in O'Connor's story where you can read every single word, and it is packed, like you said, storied with meaning in a way that we don't look at our current world that way. We don't see all the stories of meaning that are around us, and O'Connor does that for us.
I'd encourage everybody to listen to that wonderful audio we have of Flannery O'Connor reading that story. And I would challenge anyone then to read the story afterwards without hearing her voice. Once you heard it, she's not like a trained interpretive reader, but boy, was she a good reader of that story.
And her lovely accent.
And that accent that is like right out of the backwoods, But she reads, very well. Again, not in a showy, dramatic way, but with real interpretive skill. And once you hear that voice, boy, you cannot unhear it. I hear that voice when I read anything of hers now.
Yeah.
You wonder, like Dostoevsky, if we knew Russian, like what did he sound like? Man. But no, she got something very deep. And that's why, I've identified her as a pivotal player in the whole Catholic tradition, because she saw something of enormous depth and power in this unexpected figure. This little, lady from the deep South who was, sick most of her life and living with her mom, and but yet she was given something. She was given like a prophetic vision. Dostoevsky gets it from they lined him up to shoot him.
Right.
Talk about she'd be a good woman if there was someone to hold a gun against her head every minute of her life. That's Dostoevsky lined up to be shot, and then they don't. Well, that's going to change you, And it did. But she had such a different experience. But yet they both saw something of enormous depth and importance for us now.
And one of the things I'm hearing as well is talking about literary formation and what that can do is that it breaks away from the autonomous and shows you the theonomous self, that your story's not over, right? It allows for mercy. It allows for recognizing that people can change and that the drama continues. Bishop Barron, you bring up von Balthasar, a lot of the theodrama. We're all participating in this, and what literature, especially good literature like Dostoevsky and O'Connor, can provide is a way in which we vicariously live that out and see it in our own lives. But something also that you bring up in your book is the fact that Dostoevsky and O'Connor had very similar cultural experiences, the American South, the defeated American South, and Russia. So maybe speak on that a little bit, and I'd love to hear kind of what is it about a shared cultural experience that creates this opportunity for good literary minds?
I think it's also the crucible of suffering that they went through. So culturally, their regions went through a lot of suffering. I mean, you look at 1950s and 60s South, and there was a lot of suffering going on in that world. And O'Connor writes particularly from the white side of that problem. But you read writers like Alice Walker or Zora Neale Hurston in the early part of that century, and they're really showing the other part of suffering in the South on the black side. But there was just suffering around in that area. And so she really digs into that. What is suffering for? Eleanor Stump, who's a philosopher on suffering, and I was on a panel with her one time, and everyone was just plaguing with questions about suffering and a good God and all these kind of things. And she's like, do you know any heroes who haven't gone through suffering?
Yeah.
And it's
that's
that's what these writers have done. I mean, some of our greatest writers have all been those who suffered. Boethius, right?
Yeah.
Dante. You look at these people that were taken out of the norm of culture, and their vision really was burned clean from all of the different contaminants of the world, in a sense, and it gives them this clarity of insight. And so that's what was happening in the South, and it was also happening in Russia for Dostoevsky, and also personally for him, having spent all that time in the prison and 7 years in prison camp. And so he writes through these experiences because he can see the world differently than most of us who are enjoying our prosperity and don't have that depth of insight.
Can I quote Bob Dylan again? He said, behind every beautiful thing, there's been some kind of pain. That's right. That's exactly right. It seems to me. Wasn't it, of course, you know Walker Percy so well, but when he's on that firing line interview with William F. Buckley, and Buckley asked that question about the South, and he said, well, we went through a defeat. We were a defeated country. And his friend Shelby Foote, right, the great historian of the Civil War, he was on, I think it might be in the Civil War documentary, the Ken Burns. He said, people often say, oh, America's never lost a war. He said, then you're not from the South. And that's not to say anything about, the cause and the righteousness thereof and any of that. It's simply to say people that have lived through the experience of being defeated, that opens something up, And I think that's true, and certainly Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor, giving you a sense of the fall, right, of loss and compromise and people struggling against their own sin and all of that. That's a crucible out of which great art often comes. No question about it.
Yeah, speaking of another of your works, of course, Bishop Barron just brought up Walker Percy, and I did want to touch on him for a bit. And I know, of course, he was a champion of literary forms and poetic knowledge, and of course, as a practitioner in medicine himself, he understood both worlds. But something that you mentioned in your book is his fight against this kind of scientistic age, and he did it through literature. He did it through. So maybe provide some examples of how he was able to combat this scientism, because we're still dealing with it now. And ways in which he was able to do that. So
the way that I see Percy is he's really picking up the tradition from O'Connor and Dostoevsky, but he's living later. He didn't die until 1988, 89, and so he was writing to a different audience than even O'Connor, who died in 1964, right? Or even Dostoevsky, who died 100 years prior to that. So he takes the things that he's learned from their example, questions about what are we here for, bringing to the reader this life or death sense. So for him, he talks about in terms of ex-suicide. His father and his grandfather both committed suicide. So the question about whether you live or die was on the table for him. He did have, in a sense, a gun being pointed at his head. And so what I've seen is that he inherits this wisdom from them, and then he turns it into a different way of talking to his reader. Most of his readers, unlike O'Connor's, they were not talking about prosperity. They were talking about self-help. They were dealing with drug abuse and substance abuse. A lot of his readers were looking for meaning. I mean, we're moving into postmodernism. They're starting to lose their sense of grounding in the world. And so he's writing about these same things that are eternal and enduring questions, but with a new form. And so his characters are lost males. They're kind of like the prefigurement of David Foster Wallace characters. And they're wandering around being like, what am I here for? What am I doing? And how do I get through Wednesday afternoon, right, at 2 o'clock? And this is the question that all of his characters ask. Now, as far as science, he was studying science, had to get quarantined because he caught tuberculosis. And what saved his life was being in quarantine reading novels. Stories gave him that purpose that he's trying to get his characters to find, not science. Science gave him a way of looking at the world that was very Ivan Karamazov. And when he talks about his own journey, he says, I was in university system as an Ivan Karamazov. I was going there, I was rationalizing everything, I was seeing with Euclidean mind. But it was the novels that had me step away from that and say, why am I here doing that? How am I going to live? And that's what novels gave him. And they really also brought him into the church. I mean, the stories of Dostoevsky, he would say brought him into the Catholic faith, as ironic as that might sound.
I didn't realize till I read your book. I don't know Walker Percy nearly as well as the other two. I didn't realize, though, that Lost in the Cosmos was a response to Carl Sagan.
Yes.
Because I remember as a kid watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Maybe our younger viewers won't remember that, but it's a good show in many ways, this popular scientist explaining things. But I remember, to this day, very vividly, the final episode was Carl Sagan getting into this sort of, looked like a prototype of a spacecraft. And then he just waxed eloquent. It was the perfect expression of scientism. It was, there's nothing science can't understand. Science explains the whole of life. Just give yourself over to science. And even as a kid watching that show, I thought, that's a little hubristic, isn't it? I mean, and so that Walker Percy himself, having been a scientist and having seen all that, but then also seen the limits of it, come on. I mean, the scientists are great, but they don't answer every question. In fact, the most important questions they leave unanswered. But man, has Carl Sagan and his avatars been successful evangelists? I can tell you that. Because every day, on social media, young people that, science, it's not scientific, so it's not true, it's not real. So that's massively important, I think, if people can get that from Walker Percy. He's good, isn't he? Again, I don't know him as well as the other ones, but at showing the kind of the boredom. Even, I remember when I read The Moviegoer, there's something boring about the novel, which in a way is not the point, that his life is like, oh my God, what a life. I mean, how dull. But in a way, that's the point, isn't it? That he's realizing that. So that's a bit like Flannery O'Connor. It's something very dark and very negative, but it's going to open you to something. It's a breakthrough of grace. Grace trying to get in, But I love the challenge to Carl Sagan. I think that's really important.
Well, I think he's challenging, you just made me think of something, he's challenging this whole Gnostic worldview.
Yeah.
And in O'Connor, right, she dies in 1964, so her works, she's talking about these mothers who worked to get where they were, most of them had grown up in the Depression, but then their children in these stories are these intellectuals who don't know what they're doing. Percy is writing only a couple decades later, and all of those intellectuals are now his main characters. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, he calls it the malaise, but it's just this sense of restlessness and a lack of identity. And what science has caused a problem when it becomes scientism is that it has divided the human being into either a body or a soul, and really not even a soul, a body or a mind, right? It's the Cartesian split. The soul has no place.
He saw that, didn't he? The influence of Descartes, right.
That was his big thing, is Cartesian dualism.
Yeah.
And so we're either bodies that need to be fixed by diet and exercise and, again, science, fixing all of our body problems, chemical imbalances, or we're minds and we just need to be fixed by the right education, the right way of thinking, Enlightenment philosophy, and if we can just fix one of those things, we'll be healed. And he's like, well, there's this third thing. He always talks about the tertium quid. There's the third thing that might be where the boredom and restlessness is coming from. It might be the Augustinian, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. There might be a soul there, and he puts that on the table. If you're not fixed by all these science solutions to your bodily problems, and you're not fixed by all these mental problems, ways of overcoming the hiccups in your mind, maybe there's a third part of you.
And he'd get to what's in the great pre-modern tradition, let's say Aquinas, who would say the soul is in the body, but not as contained by it, but as containing it. And see, Descartes is the unraveling of that. Something fell apart. When the classical people could say, soul and body, because the soul, as it were, contains the body. That gives you a whole different approach to anthropology. When you see the soul as kind of something like Descartes, it's inside, the ghost in the machine, that's a whole different anthropology. And we see it today in the, my body doesn't really matter. I'll just decide what my body is going to be. I'll decide what kind of person I am. I'll decide the purpose of my life or even the shape of my own body. Well, I mean, that's a Cartesian conceit, But if the soul encapsulates the body, so to speak, the soul is greater than the body and includes it, it animates it, that's a different anthropology and a whole different approach to life. So the discovery of soul as opposed to a Cartesian ghost in the machine, that's key to spiritual health,
Right. Well, and Lost in the Cosmos is the last self-help book you'll ever need.
Yeah, right.
Because what you discover in the book, that he is never explicit. Percy was much more indirect than someone like O'Connor, who's kind of just going to hit you with it, right?
Yeah.
Because, again, his audience demanded he be more indirect. So the last self-help book, by the end of it, you get to realize, I can't help myself. So I thought I could fix my problems with the right diet, exercise, or the right medicines for my body. I thought I could fix my problems by the right education. But if the soul thing is here and it's broken, what do I do? Can I ask for help? And so the whole book leads you to this answer that says, like, can you help me at the very end of that book, right? So you have to actually reach out, and God has to help
Grace.
you help the soul. And grace is the missing thing that he never explicitly says.
Yeah.
It's right there the whole time.
Because he wrestled with depression a lot, didn't he?
Yes,
Walker Percy, and would be concerned about things like self-help. I mean, how do I solve this problem?
Mm-hmm.
And this side of the eschaton, we're not going to solve it. That's I think a key insight. A lot of young people, no, I got problems, but I can solve them if I just do. You know, at the physical level, at the psychological level, and part of a Christian's intuition is like, no, you're not going to solve it this side of the eschaton. You won't. You know, so what's the famous Reinhold Niebuhr, you know, Lord, make me reasonably happy in this life. But that's a really profound prayer. I mean, don't make me perfectly happy. It's not going to happen. Make me reasonably happy, Lord, you know, because the real happiness will come only when my soul rests in God ultimately. But that's key. If I think I'm going to be happy in this life, Chesterton said that. If I think I'm going to be happy in this life, I'm going to be miserable. It's only, he said, when I realized I'm not going to be happy in this life, that I actually began enjoying my life.
Yeah.
I think that's a Christian, biblical sort of take on things.
Or Solzhenitsyn, who said if a person was meant to be happy, he would not be born to die. Right? Death kind of defeats this notion that happiness is available perfectly in this world. And for Percy, I just want to give some hope here. Yes, you're not going to be perfectly happy in this world, but how do you overcome that divide? The Eucharist. For all of his characters, when they return to the sacraments, so sacrament is essential in Percy.
Yeah.
People return to the sacrament of marriage. People return to the sacrament of the Eucharist. And when they return to that sense that the body and soul is connected intimately this way, and you can experience that way on earth, then you're receiving grace, and that reception of grace is the key.
That's good. That's helpful, because Aquinas, when he discusses the sacraments, why is there both matter and form? You know, and his answer is because we're not angels, because we have both matter and form. You know, but it sounds like a simple thing, but it's right in our point, isn't it? Is it because we're the integration of soul and body, then we need the sacraments, which address both elements. But it's also the sacraments being grace, because it's not something I'm accomplishing, it's something I'm receiving as a gift, as a grace. That's good. That's helpful, the sacramental dimension. And you find it in Flannery, certainly. You know, the Eucharist and so on is very strong. Dostoevsky, of course, is a Russian Orthodox. Interesting. I don't know.
Well, and he's got the incarnational aesthetic, though.
For sure.
Really, he's definitely wanting you to embody things. I will say, we've been talking about liberal learning, too. So with Percy, if you see yourself a certain way, you're either a ghost in a machine, or you're just a brain, or the way he'd put it is you're angels, you're this abstract entity. Without the body, you're going to teach differently. And what you teach people needs to be science, math, programming, right? Because all human beings are just computers that need to take in a certain amount of information to be successful in the world. And so Percy's also giving us great examples for how to teach differently, what learning should be, freedom. You only teach liberal arts if you believe there's a soul that needs to be free, right? And so all of it kind of goes back to this idea of education and what we think people are, the people that we're educating.
That's good.
This has been absolutely fantastic conversation, and I thought maybe just to end, given the limited amount of time we have left, maybe some final thoughts and words of advice, and maybe Jessica, we'll start with you.
You're asking me to be wise?
Yes.
Some final thoughts. Well, I think I want to end with the idea of meaning and enchantment in the world that we've kind of been hinting at, this multi-storied. I was looking at a tree today, and I was thinking, well, if you just look at that tree, you're either thinking it an object that's for my beautiful perception, or you can look at that tree and say, I could cut it down and use it for all these different things. Or the tree could be alive, and there could be things I don't know about that tree, and it could be worth discovering. And I started thinking about the different authors that I've read and the myths they've taught me about the world and the ones that are true. And those myths have become lenses where I can imagine the world with more story, more level to it, and get to see all these things in a tree. And I think that that's what we should be doing in education, is we should be cultivating imagination with certain kinds of stories that not only tell us just about the tree and how to see it, but also how to see ourselves as part of this story, both that began before us and is ongoing. And it's just a different, more enchanted, mysterious, beautiful way of imagining who we are and why we're here.
I don't know what I got to add to that except to say the feeding of the soul, the recovery of the soul. Years ago, when I was first started writing, there was a book called Care of the Soul, and it was a very popular book. But that's an old idea, cura animarum, and that's where curate comes from, or curé, so what a priest's job was, care for the soul. And I used to teach my students that, we have doctors of all sorts of things, doctors of the body and of the mind and so on, specialized doctors of different parts of the body. But who's doctoring the soul? And soul, not in this Cartesian reductionistic understanding, but soul as Aquinas understood it. That most fundamental level of my being where I'm attached to God and the things of God. What goes wrong with the soul? Now, welcome Dr. Dostoevsky, Dr. O'Connor, Dr. Percy, who they're great diagnosticians of what goes wrong with the soul. But then, how do you cure it? All right, doctor, help me. And they all do in different ways. So you're thinking about the sacraments in Percy. I didn't know that. That's really good. Or Dostoevsky, how do you cure it? Well, how about perform a simple act of love? Often on the social media, I'll get a comment from someone, and they might say to me, I'm really depressed. I'm really lost. I feel cut off from God, and can you, explain something to me? And I'll say, let me just say this to you. Perform every day a simple act of love, and I think you'll find yourself more on the path to God, And that's Dostoevsky, isn't it? Is just the massive problem of sin and suffering and wickedness. Okay. Enter into the suffering of somebody and try to do it in love, and then hurrah for Karamazov. I mean, that's the answer, So care for the soul, feeding the soul, diagnosing the problems of the soul, proposing solutions to the soul. That's what our culture needs, I think, massively.
That's wonderful. And this is, as I said, been a wonderful conversation. And so encourage all of our viewers to go read as much O'Connor, Dostoevsky, Percy as we can. And Jessica, thank you so much for your time. And Bishop, it's always wonderful to have these conversations.
Yeah, enjoyed it immensely. Thanks.
Yes,
thanks for your books, and thanks for being here today.
I really loved it.
Right.
Good.
Well, thank you again.
I'm Dr. Anthony Pagliarini.
I'm Dr.
I teach
Holly
theology
Woodway.
at the University of
I'm
Notre Dame.
Christopher Kaiser, Professor of Philosophy at Nelson.
And I'm
Stacy Trasenkos.
Todd Warner. I'm an internal medicine physician.
Father Stephen Gadbury, priest from the Diocese of Union.
Well, a very special greeting to all the members of the Word on Fire Institute. Good to be back with you.
Imaginative Apologetics. Now, Imaginative Apologetics is the name of our course overall.
In the coming lessons, we'll be looking at what I call the 4 integral features of the Catholic narrative.
Because this whole series is about how we are to evangelize the culture, and it's that Jesus wants us to go out and not be afraid to do just that.
Newman enumerates the principles of Christianity. Principle of dogma, we've seen.
I teach the literature of the mystical tradition at the Angelicum University. And